So let's start with 10 minutes thinking time. Okay, we're ready to share our ideas. Who's going to speak first? Because that person shares their ideas first. Go on, Rana. All right, what have you got?
So the first thing I wrote down is that sport will be more entertaining. That's not our main piece of material. I think the principle is probably something to do with bodily autonomy, and then probably compounded by the fact that it's transparent and there'll be like high levels of consent and regulation. And I think therefore people can take whatever medication or performance enhancing.
I think there's also a principle in the fact that we allow like sporting like institutions and athletes and stuff to find competitive advantage in ways that aren't just training anyway. For example, like buying like the best quality bathers that are completely like
partnerships with like
friction-free partnerships, getting like the best quality. Like I don't know, I was watching a thing on how like Australia can never win bobsledding because we don't have the money to buy the good bobsleds. So like we allow people to like find competitive advantage in it. So this is just an extension of using resources and like skills, like doctors and training and stuff
to like what currently
to getting competitive advantage. Like that shouldn't have to just be based on like amount of training.
The other thing is like obviously there's a lot of money in sport and like doing well in sport, and so the research that would go into developing performance enhancing drugs I think would probably drastically increase. And that could have some really significant flow-on effects to like neurodegenerative treatment, because performance enhancing drugs essentially just like help with like muscle function, that kind of thing. So like it probably would have like significant benefit to those people, which is maybe like a second speaker. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Tash?
Like you said, entertainment, so we can see what humans can do, something about like pushing limits. That's what, for example, the Olympics all about. And I think as well, if we establish that people do it anyway, this way it's going to be evening playing field, transparency, safety.
So I think that the problem in this debate that this is trying to address is that there's such a widespread illegal use of performance enhancing drugs. That means that you can never be sure that you have an even playing field, because in any given race or competition there's always the chance that you have people who aren't on performance enhancing drugs versus people who aren't on performance enhancing drugs, and I think that's a pretty big problem with sport. I also think there's another problem in terms of when it's non-regulated, people do it to an extent that it is unsafe. I think that just comes as a byproduct of athletes like dedicating their life to the sport and being willing to put their body on the line. I think that, our principle is something along the lines of bodily autonomy, but also specifically in the realm of sport in terms of people like being allowed the freedom to find that competitive advantage. And I also think, as well as like buying equipment, this just occurred to me, it's also in the line of like people have certain diets and they eat certain things and they sleep and they have certain nutritionists. It's like this is just another way that they can do that. But I think our major practical benefit is obviously with legalising comes regulation. So that means that like we know what everyone who's like doing that event is on, so it's an even playing field. It could lead to a world where we have categories of like this bike race is the one with performance enhancing drugs, this one's the one without, things like that. And also regulation in terms of safety and health, and then the flow-on effects of just research into drug use in general, and then also the entertainment quality of sport.
Great. Any ideas on case split?
All right, so let's start our crafting process. So, setup.
What do we think?
So to set up this debate, we need a model. I think the model is fairly intuitive in this topic. Legalise, there would probably be committee oversight, regulations. We could have divisions with and without.
Will we like put dosing limits on drugs, or will it just be like legalise use?
How do you mean?
Do we legalise performance enhancing drugs in certain amounts? Is that what we mean by regulation? Or by regulation do we mean like frequency, like how are we going to actually regulate this safety of taking drugs as opposed to someone administering it just with like a co-trained individual?
Right, I mean there probably would be regulations in terms of like you can take this amount by like these types of drugs, maybe even just like central like places where people go to get drugged up. I don't actually. As someone who plays a lot of sport, I wouldn't know.
Isn't there a thing like safe injection rooms or something?
But that's more for like heroin, probably. But like, I'm not sure how dangerous it is to inject
I think
steroids.
Yeah, so I think maybe like an approval mechanism. So like some sort of oversight, an approval mechanism for like existing performance enhancing drugs and any new ones that are developed to ensure like a certain level of occupational safety.
Yeah.
And then dosing limits, I think, which is probably a bit more of a conservative model, but I think it's important.
Yeah, I like that. How are we going to, in setup, characterise the status quo? So what's the problem at the moment?
I think it's very much what you said. We just characterise that some athletes take performance-enhancing drugs more than we find out about to a large extent. It causes all sorts of problems when there isn't a level of transparency there, which is like, I don't know if, I think this is like characterisation if we move through it very quickly, but I think things like that whole Tour de France thing, where
So
like the winner
Yeah.
was found to be dosing far later and then that.
I actually think that the problem is in almost all cases of detecting performance enhancing drugs. So I think, yes, first we say more people are taking them than we find out, but when we do find out, in almost all cases, it's retrospectively, and then we can talk about how like that competition has come and gone, like that opportunity's been ruined. So like no one would have known what the outcomes of that competition would have been if those drugs weren't involved. All we can really do is like go back and like retrospectively take that person's first place away.
Is it actually something about like media coverage in sport? The fact that the like quality or like there's always speculation as to whether a winner has dosed or not.
Yeah.
Like almost always. Especially if they've been caught once before or whatever, and so like a lot of the media coverage around high level sport is about speculating whether someone's dosing, and so when you actually like legalise and regulate that, media around sport becomes more about the actual performance of athletes and like I guess more gratifying media coverage in a sense.
Is that like racially motivated at all?
I think sometimes it can be, especially if people see like one person of a certain race doping that's like a notable athlete, then they
And it
tend
also
to
becomes,
generalise.
it also gets tied to nations, so like being like, oh, all Russians dope, so I can't trust that person. All,
Maybe that's the second speak material, and then the research stuff will go first.
Alright, so to stay on track, the way we characterise the problem in the status quo is that there's like rife and widespread use of doping. I think we can say this is something that's a huge problem. I think we say two things: more athletes take performance enhancing drugs than we find out, so there's never a guarantee of an even playing field. And secondly, when we do find out, it's almost always retrospectively, so you've lost that opportunity to have that even and fair competition.
And if something goes wrong, you feel like you can't talk to anyone about it.
That is also true.
Or tell the authorities.
Yeah.
That is also true. So also I think
I feel like we're getting into harms of, like I feel like we're getting into proving things in characteristic, which I don't think is very. I think we just have to be like very like, this is the world. Some people don't, some people don't. A lot of the times we don't know about it, we find out in retrospect, and then leave all the harms and stuff to the material.
Okay, so in our setup, so we've got a model, we've characterised what the problem is, and basically, is that everything for our setup? Who does this affect? Athletes, people who watch sport. Cool, so stakeholders. We've got awesome. Alright, the next step is for us to step out our principle.
Yeah, I think athletes have a right to dope on an individual level and then on like a systemic level. And I think on the individual level, we say the bodily autonomy stuff. And on a systemic level, we already allow them to get competitive advantage in analogous ways. And then that's like our principle.
Right, so principle, why athletes have a right to dope.
Yeah.
And then we kind of have like a 1A sitch with individual level and a 1B sitch with institution. Okay, on an individual level, bodily autonomy. So what is bodily autonomy and why does it matter?
Right, to
Question
do what
for the
you want with your body.
Yeah. And why does it matter? Why do we allow people to do what they want with their body?
I think because we respect that the primary effect of whatever you do to your body, you bear the harms, you bear the benefits, and I think that that's an individual assessment.
And I think specific to this debate, that is a precedent that has been upheld with athletes in that we let them push their bodies to the limit. They train for crazy amounts of hours, they train from a young age. We let them push their bodies to the limits because we recognise that they are the ones who live with the consequences of their decisions. And so if they are willing to go to that extent, it's probably because their personal way up is success in this sport is more important to them than the consequences to their body.
Yeah.
That's a way up that we respect.
Yeah, so I think that will be the purely principled bit, is they have a right to push their bodies, etc. And then I think we say it can be reinforced by our mechanism of regulation, which makes it increasingly safe as you legalise more performance-enhancing drugs and research them more for athletes to exercise that level of bodily autonomy. And then the second one on competitive advantage. I'm going to use your bobsledding example because I like it.
I like it as well.
Me too.
So I think we say that teams and institutions find the ability to create a competitive advantage, and that we acknowledge as a society that isn't just through hard work and training, it's also through things like special diets, special sleep schedules, special equipment, sport is a whole lifestyle, it's not just training. If we allow them to use money and resources to find competitive advantage in those ways, they should be allowed to use that. Yeah.
Totally.
Cool, that makes sense. I'm just going to put bobsledding there. Alright, and I'm also going to make a voiceover that's going to be like, when your principal always identify what it is and why it should apply in this situation.
I don't know why I'm just doing that.
Just some doodles? Alright.
So who's speaking first?
Right now.
I will.
Alright.
Do you want to speak second or third?
I'll go second. Unless you want to.
Okay,
So that's principle. I think I've got a piece of material. I think it actually should be, I don't know, because the research stuff I think is harder to prove, but the benefit I think is way more important than the entertainment aspect or quality of sport.
So I think our first practical material should be that legalisation equals regulation, and why it creates a fairer.
Or safer?
So I think our general thing is why we value regulation, and I think our two claims are fairer and safer.
Okay, yeah, sure.
Just because I think in terms of the flow of especially demonstrating.
Fairer and safe. So safer, fairer, flow on impact, entertainment, better.
We could include that.
Fairer, safer, more transparent, I think, and then it's
Yeah, we could include that. I just think for development material, I really want to show that clear thing between being here's the problem, here's how we solve the problem.
Yes,
The problem is people. So, better regulation. So we need to step through why we get better regulation, and then we'll go through all the claims of what you get when you get better regulation.
Okay, so what does regulation look like? Is that the first question?
So regulation looks like, because it's, so I actually think we do that in a negative and being when it isn't legal, it's impossible to regulate because no one's going to admit that they're doing it. No one's going to tell people that they're doing it. You can't put rules on how to hypothetically use steroids if you were using steroids because people shouldn't be using steroids. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So you can't get regulation when it's not legal. When it is legal, we can do things like have oversight committees who can administer the drugs, can administer amounts of the drug.
And if something goes wrong, it's easier to get accountability.
But
Love that all your notes are drawings. Kind of is that a bobsled?
I think I
It
will.
is a box.
I think I will be using these
Yes.
notes as examples.
Definitely use those.
Alright. So why do we get better regulation? So what is
I think it's like, why is regulation impossible? Like you said, X, Y, Z. What does regulation look like? Why is that possible when you legal? What does regulation look like when you legalise? And it looks like oversight committees putting in place, like systematic ways. I think it's like oversight committees investing time into like, I don't know.
I think also, if nothing else, if it's legal, people can declare what they're on. So before the race begins, you can be like, we know that this person is on this dosage of this. We know that this person is on. I mean, presumably they would all be on the maximum dosage, right? But you can be like, we know that like everyone. And I think that just like if we just bring it back to the basics, that's the biggest advantage, right? The difference between like watching a sporting race where someone absolutely cleans the competition and no one knew that they were on, a certain amount of performance enhancing drugs. Versus a competition where you're like, okay, we know that this person has taken this, they're on this, it's been administered by,
Okay, so I think it's like, what does it look like? Committees which implement dosage and approval guidelines for like approving existing and up and coming performance enhancing drugs and placing limits on the safe amount to dose.
Yeah.
Do we then mitigate our material about transparency?
Yes. So, that's what I was thinking about. Do we hardline it and say you can take as much as you want, you just have to declare how much you're on? Or do we set limits on safe amount? I think it is more strategic for us to say you can take as much as you want, you just have to declare it. Because if we
Sport
prove,
is about pushing yourself.
and if we prove that people do it when it's illegal, they're gonna do it when it's illegal.
I think the way up is like we either mitigate our transparency material or we mitigate our safety material. Do you get what I mean? Because I think it's
I am more happy to mitigate our safety material because I don't think anything in professional sport is particularly safe.
Okay.
In terms of like the injuries people sustain over a lifetime from like training from the age of 4.
So maybe like suggestions?
Yeah.
Suggestive guidelines?
Yeah.
But like no repercussive.
Yeah. I think
That's probably won't say it like that.
as in you can have a committee that can have complete I think we can have informed athletes, so we can have open research into the possible health detriments of certain drugs, of the possible like repercussions, blah blah blah. But it's you are allowed to take it if you want.
Yeah. I think we should do like, what does dosing look like under their side? What does dosing look like, rather than what does regulation look like?
Okay.
So like, what does dosing look like currently when regulation is impossible because it's illegal? It looks like an individual and a coach who's gunning for that person to perform particularly well, taking that drug in very private circumstances, the athlete probably not being extremely informed of what that drug will do to their body.
So you use the example of Essendon, right? And that all of them claimed like we didn't even know what we were taking. Our doctors were just giving us pills.
Yeah.
Glad I watch enough sport to have some examples.
And then I think we say so our regulation and guidelines will have like a primarily informative role rather than restrictive role, and also include harm minimisation procedures, like
and I think
officials and like refs being educated on what to do if like
something goes wrong.
Yeah.
And I think that the way we defend that is two-part, in that firstly, if we were to compromise our accountability, you also compromise safety, because at the point which people are overdosing anyway and not telling people about it that they're overdosing anyway. And also, my limited understanding of performance enhancing drugs is that most of the effects aren't immediate, they're also long-term degenerative effects. And I think we just say that is what athletes sign up for anyway. Like most athletes' bodies just like fail them by the time they get to the age of 50. This kind of is just part and parcel of that, and it's what they sign into. And I also think we can support having different, that's what sport does, right? It has different leagues for different things, for athletes who don't want to do that, being like...
I think that mitigates our material in the sense that people just dope in the non-doping races anyway. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's... Yeah. But I guess even if that happens, they still get the same information.
No, yeah, I reckon get rid of the different leagues thing. I think we just say, I'm thinking in a more rebuttal mind now, if they come out and be like, it's unfair to have a world where to be an athlete, it's an expectation, you should dope. I think we just say that's kind of what the world is. Like, if you want to be a competitive athlete now, that's what the expectation is.
And I think it's like you shift media coverage from being negative if you dope to positive if you don't dope. So like if the expectation, like right now, you don't get praise for athletes who don't dope. You get negative coverage of athletes who do. When all of that is very transparent and people actually see how many athletes are doping, it becomes like, oh wow, this guy won and he was doing it 100% like drug free.
So I think our 3 benefits that we claim under getting better regulations are we get, the first one is more accountability in terms, more transparency. And we talk about why that creates better sport. Like just fairer competitions, better sport in terms of like, like people winning fair and square rather than like having doping scandals. Better media coverage and like the way we talk about it, and I think that ties into entertainment and the entertainment value of the sport, and safety to an extent in that people are more informed.
Okay, so broad case split, right to dope, better sport, and then I'll unpack all of those different benefits within that, and then the medical stuff, or should I leave out the medical stuff?
I think you should, 5 minutes, far out. How confident are you that you will get to the medical stuff, or do you want me to take it a second?
I'm still tossing up the best way to structure the better sports stuff.
I think the way you structure it is like, think about it in terms of that problem solution, right? Problem is you watch a sport, you have no idea who's doped who not, that creates unfair sport, that creates unsafe conditions for the athletes, and that creates bad media coverage, right? Like, once we can have, I think the best way to center it is around transparency. Like at the end, if nothing else, if we know exactly what everyone on that playing field is on, that is a huge benefit for 3 reasons. Firstly, because you get a fairer competition.
Yeah, okay, wait, hold on, sorry.
That's okay.
So I think, that's okay.
That's okay.
Okay, so I think it's like, what does doping look like right now? Y, Z. This creates a couple of problems. Firstly, lack of transparency. Secondly, like lack of information and safety. Like, I think that's pretty much it, right?
Yeah.
What will doping look like when it's legalised? It will look like regulated and transparent doping. That solves these 2 problems in these ways, mechanism 1, mechanism 2. Impact, more enjoyable sport, better media coverage of sport, safer dosing, harm minimisation.
Yeah. Alright, do you need time to write that down?
Yeah, I'll just write it.
Alright. And I think timing wise it'd probably be better if I just took the stuff on flow and effects at second.
I think also we can include the reasoning that the harm of performance enhancing drugs is self-limiting, in the sense that athletes go to a point with performance enhancing drugs and not past that, because past that point it negatively affects them health-wise, and then they cannot perform athletically. So I think we just like to mitigate some of the safety stuff.
And then I think your very clear split is principal, short-term, long-term.
Sounds good.
Long-term research into drugs and medication. Okay.
So I think the first thing is to set up sport, very profitable. Countries invest millions of dollars into performing well at events like the Olympics. On a micro level, clubs and like stuff invest loads.
I also think it's probably fair to say that like this research already exists. It's just not public because people are shush about it because it's illegal.
Yeah, I think yeah, like I think that's more like a better quality and ethical standard of research into performance enhancing drugs than what exists currently.
Yeah.
But I think the most powerful stuff is like more capital and investment into